The idea of this activity is to have the opportunity to know more about our invitees' work and life and reflections, thoughts. So I will start with some questions, and we start a conversation that then you can take it on and continue wherever you want to. There is no goal here except for having an open conversation. So let me start, Steve, with a very, well, first of all, thank you again for being here at Universidad las Hespérides. I would like to start with an anecdote. The first time we met, I believe, was in the Zündholzfabrik, thanks to Pierre and his father, in Germany, northern Germany. And I remember the importance for us as students to have a professor that spoke about economics and classical liberal theory, but had such a deep insight into history. For us was really important. That was like the glue that put many different ideas, thoughts, reflection, hold them together. So my first question is, why history? Why did you study history? At what point did you decide, I want to study history?
When I was about 7, I knew from as early as that age that this was the subject I really loved. So when I was a child, I inherited a large number of books from my father and my grandfather. I mean, not inherited, they were both still alive at that point. And also lived in a house where the previous owners had moved to Australia, and they'd left behind a lot of books. And there were many, many books of history there. And it was that, plus books about Greek mythology, that I read mostly as a child. And I soon realized that it was history that really fascinated me and interested me. And as I say, I was about 7 or 8 at the time. And thereafter, throughout my earlier years, I was a voracious reader of history, and that's why it was the subject I chose to study when I went up to university at St Andrews in 1972. And I became, as I studied it, more and more convinced, as I still am, that history is in some sense the master discipline, the one that brings together or unites all of the others, because the subject matter of historiography, historical research and writing, is of course the entire past of the human species, or indeed of the planet. And therefore any other kind of discipline cannot be fully understood except in terms of how the world in which we live came to be, which is the big question that the historians are asking. And so it was, for me, a complete intellectual no contest matter from about the age of 17 onwards that this was the subject I was going to study, even though I was very interested at that stage already in a number of other disciplines and the light they could cast on this enterprise of studying the past.
And you've worked both in the academy and outside the academy,
yes,
with non-profit think tanks. Where do you see both going? I mean, both type of institution. Where do you see the academy going? The state of the academy, looking at a trend of this, whatever, 500 years of academy, and where do you see the think tanks going?
Good question. I think the state of the academy at the moment is rather bad, quite frankly. I think the academy, the university and associated institutions is going through one of those episodes which it's had repeatedly over the last 1,000 years since the university appeared as an institution in Western Europe at Bologna, where it has fallen from its place as the main centre of intellectual activity. And in the 19th century, for example, and the later 18th century, most of the major scholars, the great thinkers that we now study, were not at university. John Stuart Mill was a civil servant in the India office. All the great figures of late 18th century France, the philosophe, none of them were studying at the University of Paris or anywhere like that. They were all in salons or writing and communicating with each other through the medium of the pamphlet. And it wasn't really until the modern university, as invented by the Germans, really appeared in other countries in the 1880s, 1890s, that the a university returned to the position it had had up to the Reformation of being the central place where academic life took place. And it was there like that when I was a young man. That was where you went to find discussion of ideas, exploration of ideas, scholarly study and all the rest of it. But I think that currently the university is at a very low ebb, as I said. And the reason for this, in my view, is not what many people blame it upon, i.e. ideological capture or ideological monoculture. I think that's a side effect. I think the primary problem is that the function of the university, the real function, as you will, what it actually does as opposed to what it purports to do, is to act as a certification machine. The university essentially is a place which regulates access to high-paid and, more importantly, high-status jobs through the granting of certificates, degrees, which are like lottery tickets that give you entry into the world of potentially high-status roles. And that is how they're perceived by governments, that's how they're perceived by most students in purely utilitarian and instrumental terms. So this is what actually led me eventually to leave the academy. It was the experience of having many students who were extremely bright, very pleasant, extremely hardworking, excessively hardworking, in fact, in my view, but who saw what they had no interest in the intellectual content of what they were studying. They saw it purely as a kind of hoop they had to jump through, an exercise they had to perform in order to get what they really wanted and valued, which was a degree. Now, there were obviously exceptions to this, who were extremely valuable and worthwhile to teach. And what you often found was that students who came with that attitude would actually become interested in what they were studying during their final year. At this point, it was a bit late. But unfortunately, what this has done, it has corrupted the academy, in my view. And it has meant that the academy has been driven by purely the need to go through a kind of mechanical process-driven form of academic life, the point of which is to graduate lots of people, and also to do research which is seen as being useful for attracting grants. So you're in the bizarre situation where academics and scholars will spend as much time applying for grants as they do actually doing any research. And the other incentives they face mean that lots and lots of work is prematurely published, so we say, in a half-digested form. So there's an enormous number of academic articles which have, according to the best surveys we have, an average readership of less than 10. Which, if you know anything about, obviously the mathematics of a distribution curve mean that there's a significant number, like about 25% of academic articles that are never read by anybody except the author and the readers, if indeed the readers of the referees have read them. And so this is a fundamentally futile activity.
So before moving into the world of think tanks, what would you say about a university that actively discourages students, potential students that want to come for a certificate, that want to come for just social relations, and explicitly says, please come only if you're intellectually curious?
Yeah. That's what is needed. And I think what will happen is that institutions like your own will appear because there is a untapped, at the moment, demand and need for the true scholarly intellectual experience and of discovery amongst both scholars and students. I think that what will happen is that institutions and groups of people will come together as the standard university model goes through its kind of stage of decay, if you will, and failure of funding, because one of the problems is it's become radically dependent upon public funding, and the politicians are starting to see this as an area to cut back on. So I think that actually this is the future for the academy. This is how it will recover. So there are places at the moment where this purely liberal form of education is starting to recur and reappear. And these are, if you like, the shoots that will grow into the trees of the future, whereas the currently big trees are going to topple over in the wind of fiscal stringency.
What about think tanks?
Think tanks are also undergoing a bit of a revolution. The think tank is a very important institution in the modern world because it's the place where free intellectual discussion of public policy and other ideas takes place. But I think at the moment there is a bit of a challenge for think tanks. The way I would express it is by saying that there are broadly four kinds of think tank. Type 1 think tanks are essentially about private meetings and research for members of the policy-making elite. The aim of these kind of think tanks like Chatham House, the Council on Foreign Relations, or the Royal United Services Institute, they're about producing a policy consensus around questions such as military policy and foreign policy, where you don't want these to be the subject of democratic contestation, because you don't want your foreign or defence policy to change abruptly when there's an electoral shift. That's not compatible with the long-term survival of the state. So those are the first kind. The second kind of think tank is the kind that was set up initially in the 1930s, but grew more in the 50s and 60s, which are universities without students, as they're often called. They're think tanks which are oriented towards pure academic research and education, essentially, and they're concerned with shifting or influencing the intellectual conversation. And there's a huge need for that, it seems to me. But since the 1970s, most of those kind of think tanks have become combined with another function, a third type, which is to produce dedicated policy analysis and proposals, oven-ready policy proposals for politicians. The reason being the politicians do not have the time themselves or the skill set to do this. And so a lot of type 2 think tanks, pure academic research institutions, also became associated with or developed into policy workshop institutions, basically. Now, the two functions used to be compatible, but increasingly they're not. It's become very, very hard to combine those two functions in the one think tank. And I think the reason is because of the development of modern media. The 24-hour news cycle, particularly, and then subsequently the advent of social media, which means that increasingly the time horizon for policy debate has shrunk, so that it's a matter of trying to influence the headlines today or tomorrow and never mind about what happens next week. And this has led to the fourth kind of think tank, where the major output is tweets. The think tanks where basically what they're trying to do is to influence the media conversation. And to the extent that you do that and succeed in that, you're going to fail in the type 2 mission of influencing and feeding into the conversation of ideas, because you're going to be so focused on the immediate demands of and ephemeral demands of the media that you won't do that, and you'll put off the kind of people who want nuance rather than clickbait. And so what I think is necessary for the think tank to move forward is for there to be a clear, if you like, I think a lot of think tanks have to decide quite clearly that they should focus on one or other of these functions and stick to that and separate out the other ones. And I think that that is what will happen going forward.
Would you say that many think tanks have become irrelevant in the last few years by trying to become impactful?
Yes, I do think so, because I think that's chasing after a hare, if you want to use an analogy. I don't even know what hare is. Hare is this animal like a rather large rabbit, which can extremely fast, but can also change direction like that. So if you chase after a hare, then it'll suddenly zoom off like that, and you're chasing after it and falling over. And the problem with doing that, trying to be impactful, is that means basically how many media hits can you get. And the media has the attention span of a gnat. And that means that you're basically going to be unable to pursue any kind of consistent or intellectually coherent research agenda, because you're going to be constantly driven by the need for media feedback.
Good. Let's go back to history. In the wealth of explosion, you argue, and you were speaking about this yesterday, you argue that the modern economic growth was contingent rather than inevitable. And what do you think was the most fragile moment in that process? What that would make the wealth explosion impossible if it failed?
Well, I actually discuss this in the book, and I date it very precisely. It's the decade of the 1580s, roughly 1583 to 1595. One of the questions is, why do episodes of dynamism, growth, innovation, cultural open-mindedness, because these all go together, these episodes of capitalism, if you will, efflorescences, as Jack Goldstein calls them, why do they typically not last? Yesterday I spoke about one reason why they don't last, which is that they run into Malthusian limits. But as we've seen in the modern world, you can overcome those Malthusian limits by sustained innovation. So why does that not happen in the past? And the answer I give in the book, and I'm not alone in this, and this is not original to me, is that elites, a combination of popular resistance and elite interest blocks it off. Because if you are in the ruling elite of a society, you welcome economic dynamism and innovation because it creates wealth that you can then tax and use for your favourite spending purposes, large palaces and wars, basically. But at the same time, if you're the emperor, the king, the ruler, you don't really want too much innovation and you don't want too much wealth because it undermines your own position. And the point is that you are at the top, so you don't want change in case it threatens your position. And so what you find repeatedly and recurrently is the elites will support popular resistance to the dynamism and they will choke off change. Now, this happens repeatedly, but in the 15th century rather, a new element comes into play globally, which is the gunpowder revolution, the transformation of warfare by the advent of gunpowder weapons and the set of military changes that this brings in its train. And what this leads to in most parts of the old world is the emergence of very large consolidated empires. So if you look at the world by the end of the 16th century, what you find is that the whole of Eurasia is dominated by about 5 or 6 giant empires. China, the Mughal Empire, the Uzbek Sultanate, the Safavid Empire of Iran, the Ottoman Empire. They control this enormous belt of territory all the way across from Morocco to the East China Sea. And then there are 2 or 3 exceptions, and one of them is Western Europe. Now, if you're a person from the Galactic Confederacy in, say, 1500, 1519, you would have reported back to Galactic Central that it was almost certain that Europe was also going to become a single empire, like Russia did. And that you would be very clear about who the candidate was. It was the Habsburgs. Because at that point, through a series of dynastic accidents, Charles V had become the ruler of not only Austria, but also the Burgundian lands, the Low Countries, also the Crown of Aragon, which means he controlled Naples and a big chunk of Italy, and also Castile, which means he controls the rest of the Iberian Peninsula, bar Portugal, and the New World being discovered on the other side of the Atlantic. And he also controls Europe's largest source of cannons at Liège. So he's an incredibly powerful position. Now, this, however, doesn't happen. And the reason why it doesn't happen is because in a very low probability outcome, the Spanish Empire, the Habsburgs, are unable to defeat the Dutch. And the critical decade is the decade between roughly the early 1580s to the mid 1590s, when it looks as though, for a while, the Spanish Empire is going to crush the Dutch rebellion. But various things happen. A crucial part is played by the man who, in my view, is France's greatest ever king, Henry IV, and they fail to do it. And that moment is past. Now, why does that matter? Because when you have a large consolidated empire like the Ottomans or the Mughals, initially this is good for trade and economic dynamism because it means a stable currency and a stable form of government over a very large area. But in the longer to medium term, the emperors have very powerful incentives not to allow economic change because an empire is by its nature a fragile construct. And if there's too much dynamism, they fear it will disrupt their empire with good reason. So the Ottoman sultans, the great Mughals, the Chinese emperors, they deliberately restrict economic innovation. And they can do this because they control an empire. Now in Europe, what you get instead is about a dozen medium-sized, quite powerful countries, but none of which is predominant because of the failure of the Habsburgs to achieve dominance. When it looks as though the French are going to do it, there's then an alliance against them and the War of the Spanish Succession, which means that they too are blocked. What this means is that you now have a lot of states which are competing with each other. And in that situation, you need innovation. Because if you're a kingdom that does not innovate, you're going to get literally eaten up by your neighbours, as happens with Poland. And this leads the British elite in particular to sponsor innovation because they're engaged in a life and death struggle with France. And the French have double the population, double the land area, double the income, a very large army and a pretty big navy. And so the British are up against it. And so they know that in order to compete with the French, they have to maximize the return they can get from their resources, and that means encouraging innovation. So as Joel Mocha describes, the British state from about the 1720s onwards is quite deliberately removing barriers to innovation, which is something that elites historically had not normally done. And that's because the incentives facing rulers change. The other example of this, and an interesting kind of contrast, is Japan, where something similar happens at the other end of Eurasia, quite independently, but that's a different story.
Culture, capital investment, energy, geography, innovation, those are all factors that different historians think that are key for the great enrichment. If you would have to tell what happened to a 14-year-old girl or boy, how would you place those factors? How would you explain
I think
the causes?
I think what you would have to do is distinguish between dynamic and structural factors. So things like geography is the most obvious structural factor because that doesn't change at all. It's permanently fixed. And geography has huge determinative effects on human society that we often overlook these days. Things like culture are also structural because they change very slowly. It takes hundreds of years for major cultural shifts to happen. Even though they manifest suddenly, the actual process is a lot longer. So in the kind of story I would be telling, those would be the kind of background factors that determine the range of options open. But then you have the dynamic factors, and the dynamic factors are things like politics, institutions, pure accident, contingency of one kind or another. These are much more short-run dynamic. They affect what is known as the conjuncture, the conjunctural level of history, the kind of 30, 40, 50, lifelong span of a human lifetime, basically. And you can point to certain conjunctures where the dynamic factors operating within the structural factors bring about quite radical change. So that's the way I would structure the story. Yeah.
Moving to something closer to us, the years of the COVID pandemic.
Yeah.
What do you think we should have learned from that? What should, I guess we're still learning from it, but from looking back, what do you think is the biggest learning of what happened and how governments reacted to it?
So, well, firstly, governments need to pay more attention to the historians. So when the pandemic started, I discovered that I seemed to be one of few people, and not the only one obviously, who knew anything about the history of pandemics. And so I was able to say very confidently right from the start, well, there's going to be at least a second wave. This pandemic is going to come in a series of waves, because that's the pattern that every pandemic in the last 2,000 years has followed. And then there were lots of people saying, no, it's just going to be a single peak like that and there's not going to be a second wave. And to which the answer is, well, logically, you're correct. This may be the first pandemic in 2,000 years that doesn't have a multiple wave pattern, but you would bet against that. And of course, the historical evidence was borne out. That is what we had. And a lot of the advice given to politicians and popular reporting of the pandemic had no historical awareness. That's the first thing we should have learned. The second thing we should have learned is the clumsiness and limitations of one-size-fits-all policy solutions like the lockdowns that were followed. What you had was an attempt, if you like, an engineer mentality, attempt to impose various kinds of controls on popular behaviour, other things that simply didn't work, were by all the measures both extremely costly and extremely ineffective. On the other hand, paradoxically, we did not do the one thing that probably would have had a big effect, which is to shut down international air travel the moment we realised that a pandemic had started. That's the one measure that could have had a bigger effect in terms of delaying the spread than anything else. But instead we didn't. And Nassim Nicholas Taleb has said, we chose the incredibly expensive route of shutting down entire economies rather than that still expensive but manageable cost of suspending international air travel for several months at the start. So that was the second thing. This is the problem of having, if you like, central planning to deal with pandemic response. It turns out that a decentralized response would have been much more effective. But the big thing I think we should have learned is this, which is the fragility of complex institutions. Because what the pandemic revealed was that many of our major institutions, above all the institutions of organized healthcare delivery, have become extremely fragile. they're unable to cope with or manage significant departures from the long-term average. So the reason why we had lockdowns, certainly in the UK and in many other parts of the world, was simply because if they were not imposed, the hospital system would have collapsed. And why would it have collapsed? Well, back in 1969, when we had the Hong Kong flu pandemic, which I remember as a child, we had something like 3 times more intensive care beds per head of population than we do now. And the bed occupancy rate in the National Health Service was about 60 to 65%. The bed occupancy rate of the National Health Service now is 95% or more, which in economic terms is extremely efficient. But what that means, of course, is that there is no spare capacity. So if you get any significant departure from the long-term average, the system will simply collapse. And that is what happened to healthcare systems in many parts of the world. The pandemic, because of the peculiar features of the COVID disease, put hospital systems under enormous strain, much more than flu would have done, interestingly, and they simply were in danger of imminent breakdown. Similarly, long-term supply chain, long-run supply chains, long-distance, that is, supply chains, and radically just-in-time delivery systems proved in many cases unable to cope with the disruption brought about by the pandemic. And so I think what we should conclude from this is that many of our institutions and systems are excessively complex, and also, and this sounds strange for an economist perhaps, too efficient. But efficient should be put in quotes there, because what it means is efficient if you assume that you will not get a tail end event. So it's a classic example. Again, I refer back to Nassim Nicholas Taleb here. Taleb is always going on about how economists think you can chop off the tails of a probability distribution and ignore them, which of course is completely insane. That works until you get a tail end event, and then you suddenly find, you've not allowed for that. And that's what we've done with many of our administrative systems.
No insurance would do something like that, right?
Well, the problem is that, again, tail end risks are difficult to calculate. That's Taleb's big point, that very often, because they're rare, you find it very hard to work out accurately what the odds of a tail end event are, particularly what you've got is a fat-tailed distribution where the long-run average is determined almost entirely by the small number of extreme events. And that in turn makes it very difficult to insure them because the insurance company does not have a clear idea of the probability it is facing of an outpayment. And if it doesn't know that, it's very difficult to do it. That said, it turns as the pandemic progressed, insurance did in fact react very quickly, was able to then provide cover for things like supply chain interruptions. But initially it was caught on the hop. Now it may well be that right now there's much better going on. On the other hand, the current events in the Gulf show that maritime insurance, places like Lloyd's, has not been able to cope with the events there, the Iranian blockade of the Straits of Hormuz. Why? Because they had seriously underestimated the probability that this would happen. And that, again, they will now adjust their schedules significantly to raise the probability of this kind of supply interruption. But at the moment, one of the reasons why no tankers are going in or out is because they can't get insurance cover, except at an astronomical cost.
Isn't precisely the war clause the quintessential event that the insurance company would
not cover, precisely because of its unpredictability, yes.
You were talking about complexity as problematic factor.
Yeah.
Do you think it's complexity or is it centralization?
It's both, because then centralization is an aspect of what is meant by the term of complexity. So the idea of complexity for me comes from the work of an American historical anthropologist called Joseph Tainter, in a book he published in the 1960s, but reissued several times since and updated, called The Collapse of Complex Societies. And Tainter argues that human societies face challenges, and one of the ways they respond to these challenges is by developing more complex processes and institutions to mobilize and use resources to deal with and address those challenges. There are two main aspects to higher complexity. One of them is greater centralization. The other is more roundabout processes, basically, if you think about, say, Bavok's account of capital. So you have more elaborate processes with more steps or stages within them, and a more roundabout way of addressing the problem you're dealing. Now, the complexity brings increased output and therefore increased ability to address the problems, says Tainter. The problem is that, like all processes, it faces diminishing marginal returns. Each additional increment of complexity brings a smaller gain in terms of increased output and higher costs, because the process also imposes costs, again, like any other economic process. And eventually you reach a point at a societal level, or even below that, where the marginal benefit of the extra complexity is equal to or less than the marginal cost. And at that point you start to get systemic breakdown, a simplification episode in which the complex systems break down and you revert back to a more simple way of doing things, which, and Tainter emphasizes this, makes economic sense for the people involved. Now, you can combine this with Friedrich Hayek. One of the reasons why increased complexity has diminishing marginal returns is because of the Hayekian knowledge problem. The more complex a system is, the more centralized it is, the fewer decision-making points ultimately there are within the system, the greater the knowledge problem faced by the people who are in those decision-making points. And the greater the knowledge problem for the system as a whole, the process as a whole, because it will be increasingly difficult for the actors within that process to access the knowledge that they need. And so it's that knowledge problem which Hayek is addressing to government, but which by extension can be applied to any large complex organization, which means that there are severely diminishing marginal returns to increase social complexity. And the nature of knowledge, of course, means that, contra what a lot of people believe right now, you can't rely upon something like AI to save the day. There are a lot of people now who seem to think that if you have an AI, you can get round these problems of complexity because it will just analyze all the data for you. And as Hayek points out, the data is not given. The data is not there. It is produced by the social process itself. And the bulk of the data is in the form of tacit knowledge, which cannot be captured or written down in words or numbers, and therefore is not accessible to an AI. It is only known through direct experience and emulation. And so that means that there are fundamental limits on how complex a process can be before it reaches that point where the marginal cost is actually greater than the marginal benefit, which is the point where you start to get a social unraveling. So that's why I think complexity is highly problematic. And one of the ways to understand the history of the last 200 years is that we've had a series of overshoots where we've overshot the level, that point of marginal balance, and had an excessive level of complexity, and then we've recoiled back from it until either new technology or other innovations have enabled us to then go back past that to another level of complexity.
Steve, in your last book, The Great Realignment,
Yeah.
you argue that the main political divide is shifting from economics to identity and culture. Why do you think that economic has lost its centrality in the political conflict?
I think partly and immediately because of the outcome of the Cold War. So if you look at the debate between the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and the fall of the Berlin Wall, although if you look at political debates, they appear to be arguments about economics, those arguments have a kind of existential quality to them. Because what you're making is not just a choice between two different forms of economic management, you're making a choice between two different kinds of civilization, two different ways of organizing modernity, one based upon a command economy or an economy that does not use market signals, and one based upon a distributed market system with a higher degree of decentralization, individual autonomy and choice. And that's a lot more than just economics. It manifests in a choice about which economic system you're going to have, but the underlying choice is actually a systemic and as I say, existential one as to what kind of society you're going to have. But that argument really ends with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The argument, if you like, is ended. It's become very clear that if you were going to have a modern society, it has to ultimately be a market society. And you will still find lots of people today who tell you they hate capitalism and they believe in socialism. But when you ask them, well, what do you mean by socialism? It turns out what they mean is Sweden. they no longer believe that there is a fundamentally different, most of them, that there's a fundamentally different system, alternative to a market economy. They just want a market economy with a lot of redistribution and a much more egalitarian income distribution. So this is true. So Thomas Piketty, for example, undoubtedly a socialist, he would describe himself as a socialist, but he's made very clear in several interviews that he believes in a broadly market economy. He just thinks that we should have a much more egalitarian wealth and income distribution. And so I think that since 1990, economics has lost that existential quality. It's become much more of a technocratic debate about what kind of economic policy is going to be the best to follow to maximize certain goods like, wealth or growth, this kind of thing. And as such, it's still important, but it doesn't affect people in a way that they see as reflecting their most profound or basic interest. Whereas on the other hand, increasingly for many people, things like immigration are seen as existential that way, because a lot of people have come to the belief that if immigration is not checked, this will be an existential threat to their own identity. And that's why the writings of people like the French writer Albert Camus and his idea of the great replacement have become such a central trope for the new rising populist right, because Camus' argument is that mass migration will actually destroy the very existence of something like the French nation, for example, or whatever other nation you care to think of. So that is now seen as having the existential quality that previously economics had.
And I guess this is why you say that the new right is here to stay.
Yes, because that's not going to go away. This is going to be, in my view, this choice between a reassertion of thick national identity as opposed to the vision of a cosmopolitan civilization is going to be the fundamental divide in politics for the next 30 or 40 years. Now, at least, probably longer, I do think that economics is going to decline even further in its importance, and this is not something I welcome, because unless we as liberals make a big effort, I think about 80% of people, and crucially a lot of the elite, are going to settle on Chinese-style neo-mercantilism as the way to go. And I think that will leave like true free marketeers and true socialists as the eccentrics who don't agree with this, and everybody else will be supporting Chinese-style neo-mercantilism. I deeply regret that, because I think that's extremely dangerous. But unless we win a few intellectual arguments, I think that's what's going to happen. At the moment, there's a lot of China envy out there, if you will, where people are increasingly impressed by what the Chinese have achieved since Deng Xiaoping, and think, oh, that's clearly the way to go.
What type of intellectual arguments should we win?
But lots at the moment. If you, I mean, certainly a lot of economists, but also primarily a lot of historians, a lot of political philosophers, a lot of sociologists, and also just more generally public policy people. They are increasingly thinking that the kind of Chinese combination of state direction but large private firms is the way to go.
Good. With this, do you have questions? Yes, I guess, or comments? Let's start with Nikolai.
Thank you, Steve, for these great insights. You've hinted at some of this, but I'd like to dig a little bit more deeply. It's always tempting for me to dismiss the end of globalization as just an electoral fad in the US, but clearly it's part of something bigger. We're also seeing a 15-year democratic regress, a 5-year economic freedom of the world regress, and a loss of a lot of the progress since 1989. And it's not just electoral, as you point out, it's also intellectual, with the rise of national conservatism, which seemed like a fun foil 15 years ago and now is something serious, and the rise of post-liberalism. Can you give us your historian's big picture perspective on this? Is this the end of the Enlightenment that we're seeing, or is it just a phase?
No, it could be between those two. I don't think it's a short-term phase, but it's not necessarily the complete end of the Enlightenment project, as post-liberals like Pat Deneen would have us believe. This is where historical comparison helps you to put the current events into perspective. During the period between 1870 roughly and 1914, you had what the French call La Belle Époque, the beautiful era, the era that produced all these wonderful buildings all over Europe. And that was an era of globalization, the first globalization, as some people rather misleadingly call it, the first truly global investment market, the world that's described in, say, for example, Anthony Trollope's The World, The Way We Live Now, or Émile Zola's L'Argent, Great novel, by the way. And what then happened was it provoked a reaction against it, a cultural, political reaction against it, which was particularly powerful and influential in Imperial Germany, but was found elsewhere. And after the Great War, what happened was that reaction then had full force, and you have an enormous retreat from that early globalization. So world trade as a percentage, international trade as a percentage of total world output, does not reach the level it was at in 1914 until 1960. That shows you how far back the tide of globalization went. The amount of capital invested outside the country in which it was formed went down dramatically and did not get back to where it was in 1914 until 10 years ago. So that shows you how suddenly in that era there was an enormous pulling back of capital, economic activity into national areas. At the same time, the 1920s was an era of, and the period from roughly the 1890s through to the 1920s was an era of quite radical social liberalism, notably in Germany under the Weimar Republic, but elsewhere as well. And what you got was an enormous pushback against that in the middle decades of the 20th century, partly because I think what happened was that by the 1890s, it became clear that the ancien regime, the old order of the alliance of throne and altar, was done for. It was gone. And you then got the emergence of three modernist ideologies, if you will, different images of what a modern civilization could be like: fascism, communism, and capitalist liberal democracy. And what capitalist liberal democracy did was to form an alliance with the more conservative elements in society against the threat of the two totalitarian forms of modernism. And that lasted up until the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then what happened after that was we reverted back to the kind of globalization of the Belle Epoque. And what we're now seeing is a repeat of what we had in the 1920s and 30s. We're seeing a big retraction from that, as you say, and a pushback against it. But the evidence is that actually this is not going to be permanent, hopefully. The reason being that what became apparent when you did try to withdraw from the globalized economy of the Belle Epoque was that this had disastrous results for everyday living standards, for intellectual freedom, for all kinds of things that people valued. And so the result of that, in turn, was that then there was a reaction against that in the post-war era. So I think that's what we're going to have. So I think we're going to have, thank you, a rough decade or so, but I think we're then going to react against that.
Returning to the original topic of education and intellectual life, we live in a time where the barriers to people discussing around the world, the best of the best, have an internet connection, can talk to each other in seconds with no hesitation. At the other extreme, you have online education and creative models being completely disparaged, right, for understandable reasons, because they've completely commodified the process, right? They're into the certification regime that you were talking about before. But even when the elite universities, the traditional elites, Yale, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, when they try to innovate and take advantage of these lower marginal costs to deliver education and intellectual life, they're disparaged. There's grumbling like, oh, it's not really Harvard, it's Harvard Extension School, whatever. Do you see a resolution to this problem, an explosion or an implosion of higher education? Is there ever going to be a fix to this increasing divide?
I think that right now we're in a kind of transitional period where people are experimenting and exploring with the use of new technology to deliver education. And I think two things are going on with what you describe. The first is that for very top level universities like Harvard, Princeton, Oxford, Cambridge, Sciences Po perhaps, what they are selling is something that is not really selling, is something that's impossible to do online. And that is face-to-face contact between future members of the elite. The real selling point for those institutions is not the academic content of their courses, it's the opportunity to rub shoulders with, get married to, form close connections with people who are going to be in the future occupying positions of high status and power. So then the point is that's not something you can do online. And so that, hence the argument that, well, this is not really what you want to pay. God knows what the tuition is to go to Harvard. It has to be delivered face to face. On the other hand, if you're just going to be doing certification studies at a mid-ranked university, you might as well just do that online. But the point is then, as you say, this sucks all the intellectual life out of it. It becomes a pure mechanical financial process. And the graduate premium that you get for that is disappearing at an enormous rate. And it's probably going to vanish in the next 5 to 10 years because what AI is going to do is to basically automate virtually all routine process-driven, non-manual work. So it's going to get rid of about 90% of accountants, 70 to 80% of lawyers, about 60% of doctors, virtually all HR managers, for which many thanks, an enormous number of middle management positions. They're just going to vanish. And we can see this happening at the moment already with all the entry-level jobs in those kind of roles vanishing. And that's what's going to lead to the financial implosion, in my view, in a lot of higher education. Now, on the other hand, two things I think are going to emerge. One is the reversion to face-to-face, physical, book-based education in small groups. The other is the development of more interactive, creative forms of online delivery, which are aimed not at simply enabling a certificate to be given, but to actually act as a kind of starting point or jumping off board for further exploration of the ideas. And I think those two are both going to grow quite significantly as the main model just implodes. And I think that we're going to see like an enormous... Well, I think in Britain, there is a very good chance that a future government will have the kind of equivalent of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, where the universities are concerned.
I want to go maybe further in that direction. You mentioned that was the two first questions from Gabrielle, the fact that those institutions, think tanks and university, are going through tough, restructuring or whatever. I would like you to comment maybe on the role of, the financial support for those institutions. Like for instance, in the think tank world, sometimes those who finance, the think tank will ask for concrete results, like outcome and so on and so forth. So, and that can push them maybe towards the media, towards, that's, and it's the same for the university probably. I mean, if it's financed by the state, then it's not like if it's financed by students or maybe by, and maybe related to that, even though that's a big, a big jump, but in your last book, you mentioned the fact that people now are kind of lost or afraid by the way the economy is being financed. This kind of international world of finance that is, maybe, some kind of conspiracy, maybe, or whatever. So if you, if you could comment on that as well.
Yes. Two things there. The second one, first of all, before I talk about the other one. Yes, there is a kind of enormous popular backlash against the domination of finance and the role of high finance in the contemporary economy, financialization as it's often called. Some of which I think is actually justified, but most of which is not. What we're getting, particularly with people like Viktor Orban, is the return of some very old tropes. So Orban, and the last time he was standing for election in Hungary, he was giving speeches talking about how we face an enemy which is present everywhere but at home nowhere, which is seeking always to undermine national independence in the pursuit of the ruthless and relentless pursuit of profit. Rootless cosmopolitans. At which point, if I was Jewish, I'd be starting to feel really nervous. Who could he be talking about? And I think that there is what we're seeing is, as I say, very alarmingly, if you're Jewish, is a recrudescence of the classic kind of tropes which have been aimed at finance throughout history. Now, the other question, I think this is absolutely true. I mean, if you ask me to date a point at which the universities funded by government started to go wrong, I would say it's the day after the launch of Sputnik 1. Because what that led to is an enormous influx of state money into universities, initially in the United States, subsequently everywhere else. And the idea behind this was the idea that if you put lots of money into universities, you get payoff in terms of more rapid economic growth and other things like that, which is almost certainly not true. I think that's getting things back to front. On the other hand, with think tanks, yes, what happens is this, I think. The type 2 think tank, the pure academic research think tank, can be run on a very small budget. And therefore, you do depend upon private funding or endowments, but what you can do with that model is to identify the rare donors who are interested in supporting pure research long-term projects, or you can rely upon having an endowment from a wealthy founder like the Liberty Fund in the US does. However, when you move into a type 3 think tank, the kind of policy workshop-oriented one, that is much more expensive because you need a lot more staff and you need a lot of resources. When you have a large media, comms department and outreach, that's even more expensive. And so this means you need a lot more funding. And since you don't want to take money from the government, and you shouldn't really, regardless of what your politics are, for obvious reasons, that means you become very dependent on a larger pool of private donors. And at this point, as you say, most of these donors are going to want what they see as results, i.e. immediate payoff in terms of political influence or impact of one kind or another. And that shifts the whole time horizon and the nature of the project that you're going to find yourself able to fund. And I think the problem at the moment is that a lot of that kind of donor has actually begun to lose confidence in the think tank as a way of influencing public policy. It appears that there's much more direct and immediate ways you can do that, like paying some money into the Trump Family Trust Fund or whatever they call it, or basically giving a large donation to a political party in return for being given a seat in the legislature, which is what happens in the UK and this kind of thing. So I think that actually, just like the major universities are in big trouble, I think a lot of these big type 3 think tanks are also having trouble. But the good news is that the type 2 think tank, the one which I think is really valuable, the one that does academic research, you can run it on a much lower budget. It's not so money intensive in terms of what it's needed, partly because academics are cheap dates, but for other reasons as well. And therefore it's a matter of finding both subscription models of funding, but also the smaller number of more far-sighted private donors who are interested in funding longer-term projects. You know.
Steve, what would you say is a key to being or becoming an excellent historian, and why is history so important for students who might be studying other disciplines?
The reason why I think history is, as I said at the start, the master discipline is because it's concerned with the totality of human experience. If you're a historian, the entire past of humanity is your subject matter. You may decide to, and you will probably decide to focus only on one very tiny aspect of that human past. But even in order to understand that very precise aspect, let's say the artistic culture of Carolingian Europe, you know, something like that, you've got to put that in a much, much wider context. So all historians, even though they may focus their work upon something very narrow and very precise, are interested in everything. They're interested in everything about the human past. And the point is that all of the other disciplines, sociology, anthropology, psychology, economics, politics, they are dealing with very specific parts of that human past. So if you're a historian, you will read works by anthropologists, you'll read works of philosophy, you'll read works of psychology, of religious theology, in order to help you have a better understanding of the sources that you then go to look at in the archive in order to find out, in the words of the great man, what actually happened to the best of your knowledge and ability. And the point also is that you cannot understand the present or the nature of humanity and the nature of the human experience without understanding the past, because that is our major evidence. You know? And you cannot understand the present unless you understand how it came to be. And that, by definition, involves the study of the process, the past, which created where we are now. And you will have a very limited idea of what the likely possible futures are and what the probability of those various futures are if you don't know how things worked out in the past. One of the things that happens when you're a historian is that you realize very quickly that, as the Romans used to say, nihil novi sub sole, there is nothing new under the sun. Pretty much everything that people think is novel is something that has happened many, many times before. And that way you can say, well, if this works out the way it has previously, then this is the most likely outcome. Like, you know, starting a land war 8,000 miles away from your home base, how does that work out usually? Not very well. That's the way you would bet, you know, that kind of thing. Attacking Russia in the winter, it succeeded once, but, you know, every other time it hasn't. As the old saying has, the Russian army has two great generals, General January and General February. No, very few people can defeat them. And so, you know, the historian has that. But also, what is important is you do recognize when something is genuinely new, because occasionally there is something that's new. And what historical judgment gives you is the ability to spot that. So what qualities do you need? You need to have a kind of voracious interest in everything and anything. To be a good historian, you have to be interested in and prepared and interested in reading about and studying absolutely anything, because it's grist to your mill. But you also have to have the ability to, you have to develop historical judgment, which is the ability to accumulate an enormous amount of information about a particular episode, event, period, or whatever, but then form that into a coherent story and make judgments as to what actually is important and what is not. And that's a kind of judgment that tends to mature with age, which is why most historians do their best work when they're over 50. Unlike physicists, so, you know, Richard Feynman famously said that if you haven't done something major in physics by the time you're 28, forget it. You're not going to do it. You have to have the kind of flexibility and ability to think crazy stuff that only young people have to be able to do it. With historians, it's the opposite. Your judgment is probably not properly formed until you're in your 30s, late 30s and early 40s, because it takes that long of ruminating and thinking about things to develop that ability to look at the past and think, that was what was really important as compared to that. And that's why all historical narratives have implied counterfactuals. There's always an implied alternative history underlying the account that you do give, because that's what tells you that this event is important, that event is not. Because what you're thinking is, well, that event is not important, because if it had happened differently, you know, things would have been pretty much the same. Whereas this event is hugely important, because had it not happened, things would have been radically different. So there's always an implied counterfactual. But of course, then historians disagree about that. And that's what makes it interesting, because of course you can never test how accurate a counterfactual is, because by definition it's inaccessible.
Steve, I'd like to challenge you a little bit. It looks, listening to you, that history was immune to a general tendency in social sciences. I mean, economics used to be much broader than it is now. It's becoming very technical. Studying law also, you used to do philosophy of law, Roman law, natural law, and now you see law as a technique, and so on and so forth. So now listening to you, look like in history it's different. They try to give, you know, the last discipline, and that will be fine. I mean, that's fine in the human sciences that will try not to.
No, you're quite right. History has been affected by the academic mania for specialization. And so you do get the phenomenon where people know more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing. This seems to be happening in history as elsewhere. I do think, though, two things I would say. One is that the discipline is more resistant to that than disciplines like economics or sociology, which are influenced by the model of the physical sciences. I think one of the problems and one of the reasons for the extreme specialization in disciplines like economics is the desire to be more like the material sciences. In history, it is very, you know, there's a kind of the nature of the discipline, as is true also for a number of other disciplines like literary studies, pulls you away from that. That said, the incentives facing researchers now are very, very powerful to publish like mad and to focus on really narrow subject matter. The second qualification I'd make about history, though, is that a lot of the most influential and widely read history now is written by people who are not in the academy. And so one of the very interesting things at the moment is the resurgence and reappearance of the popular historian, people who do not have an academic position, but write scholarly works of history which are very widely read. or even if they are in the academy, the books that they're best known for are not ones that will then get into any research assessment or evaluation exercise. So Adam Tooze, for example, who's a historian at Yale, he's an economic historian, he wrote a book a few years ago about the Nazi economy. It was called The Wages of Destruction, which is a kind of economic history of Nazi Germany. Brilliant book. And that that didn't get him any brownie points in the academy, but it's had an enormous popular impact, and it's very good scholarly work. William Dalrymple's books about the history of the British in India, the Mughal Empire, again, he's not got an academic position, but enormously influential. So I think history is perhaps a bit of a forerunner of some other disciplines, actually, where a lot of it is moving out of the academy because of the constraints that the incentives in the academy impose upon real historical scholarship, where you are led to publish articles about, Venetian shipbuilding technique 1483 to 1485. That's from Lucky Jim, that particular example.
No more questions or comments? Then I have a last one. In your work, I see very important topics like fragmentation, decentralization, innovation, complexity. Often when I hear you or read you, I have to think about the Hanseatic League.
Yes.
Because it is, for me, I'm not a historian, it's like the embodiment of many of those
Yes.
causes working together in an episode in time. Do you think that we should look in episodes like the Hanseatic League to learn something out of the dynamics and try to bring it to our times, or?
100%. So one of the most important books of history written in the last 30 years, in my view, is a book called The Sovereign State and Its Competitors by Hendrik Sproit. And what Sproit points out is that we have a kind of deterministic historical narrative in which the end state of social and political evolution is the territorial sovereign state that we see emerging in Europe and actually other parts of the world, but mainly in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Hobbesian nation state, basically. And Sproit says, well, no, that is not true. Leaving aside empires, which actually are historically even more predominant, the other alternative he identifies is the city-state and the League of City-States, like the Hanseatic League. And his argument is, in the book, is that this was a valid and real-world alternative, and in some parts of the world, like Southeast Asia, until the Dutch arrive, it's the one that's winning. And I think that, yes, we do need to explore this and have its relevance for today, because the big problem at the moment, going back to my thesis about realignment, is that we have a system of global governance, the so-called rules-governed international order, which was created primarily by the United States, but also to some extent by its allies, after 1945 through GATT and then various international treaties and agreements. And that provides a system of supranational governance for the world economy. The point is, it's breaking down. It is now facing huge political pushback. The WTO has been paralyzed now for the last 9 years or so. The geopolitical competition, particularly between the US and China, is undermining that system, which ultimately rested upon US primacy, if not hegemony. And we are relapsing into a world of great power competition, where the very idea of international law is now being called into doubt by events like the war in Gaza, Donald Trump's attack on Iran, the way the Chinese are behaving as well, or threatening to behave in places like the South China Sea. They're clear putting pressure on Taiwan and so forth. So what are classical liberals to do? And I think that what we should not do is go down the route of defending the rule-bound international order, the status quo, because it's quite clearly defunct in my view, and we can't really put that particular Humpty Dumpty back together again. But there's an alternative, and the alternative is the one that people like Richard Cobden advocated in the 19th century, what he called the municipalization of the world, breaking large complex states up into much, much smaller units, city-states, Manchester as a country, as he put it. And the structural model of that, beyond that, is something like the Hanseatic League. And this is a kind of radical model for political order, which actually has quite a big history going back. People like, as well as people like Cobden and many classical liberals, you have people like País Margal, for example, in Spain, famous radical liberal socialist of the 19th century, or Proudhon with his theory of federation, which is another great example of this bottom-up federation system. Or in the modern world, the late Murray Bookchin, who started off life claiming to be a communist anarchist and ended up saying, well, no, I'm not, I'm something else. But he had this very interesting series of books about what he called libertarian municipalism. And this is a very radical way of thinking, but I think it's something that we liberals need to explore as a kind of alternative to both the kind of realist great power competition that the world is going into. We know where that ends up, and it's nowhere good. It's usually wars, and big ones, or alternatively, the system which has been around since certainly the fall of the Berlin Wall and probably since 1948, the so-called rule-bound international order, which is essentially a cover for the hegemony or the domination of one particular country, the United States. Hence the system whereby there's rules which apply to everybody else, but not to the Americans, it would appear. And you can only go on for doing that for so long. And so I think, yes, to answer your question very directly, yes, 100%. The Hanseatic League, leagues of city-states, the idea of the city-state, this is something we should be, definitely exploring, pursuing, applying to the contemporary world.
Steve, thank you so much. You're a polymath, and it's a pleasure to have a conversation with you. Thank you for being again here in the Canary Islands. At the
My
Universidad
pleasure.
Hespérides.
Delighted to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you.